It's my nerd world, and welcome to it, a space opera podcast. On the show this week, we'll do a brief intro to a space opera podcast and what you can expect in weeks to come. Plus, we'll dive into the space opera genre. How broad is it, and how much of this is subjective as to what qualifies as a space opera and what doesn't? We'll look back this week at the Wachowskis, who were most well known for making The Matrix and their epic, underrated, and beautiful Jupiter Ascending. Our preview this week will be Ridley Scott's new HBO Max series, Raised by Wolves, and we'll talk a bit about whether or not this technically qualifies as a space opera. I personally believe that it does. Also, this week's Amazon Space Opera Top 10 and so much more. This week's episode is brought to you by Zone. 1 million users united with one mission: to take back social media. And with your help, Zone will take billions from today's social media giants and give it back to the users. I'm concerned about the increasing amount of censorship coming from social media companies, and that's why I'm a part of Zone. Zone is a brand new social media outlet that's launching very soon, and it's completely revolutionary. It's a better all-in-one social media alternative. It eliminates the need for social media giants. With one profile, you're able to create multiple zones using different avatars that suit your online persona needs. Zone is also user-owned. You can become a Zone ambassador. It's free for a limited time, and you'll get increased influence as well as a variety of other advantages. Anyone can invest to own more of the Zone platform, and at very little cost. But don't wait. Zone's claimed first will have more influence. Zone launches soon, so join me and claim your Zone today at ourzone.zone. That's ourzone.zone.
My Nerd World.
This is a space opera podcast here on My Nerd World, and I am your host, Jon Justice. I'm glad you're with the show this week for August 22nd. The email is talkshownerd@gmail.com, and the website is mynerdworld.net. There at the website, you can find out about all things My Nerd World, the podcast, whether it's a space opera podcast, or it is a Star Wars podcast, or a Depeche Mode podcast. All the details are available at mynerdworld.net. Also, all the information about the EMBARK science fiction series written by me. More details on that at the end of the show. Plus, I have a special giveaway running this week that you do not want to miss out on. All the details are coming up a little bit later on in this week's episode. So I did the preview podcast for this podcast a couple weeks back, and it's taken me a few weeks to get it off the ground just because life happens to go and move that way. But as I mentioned in the preview podcast, in case you happen to go and miss that particular episode, the reason why I decided to do a space opera podcast is because there's no podcast dedicated specifically to space operas. And space opera as a genre is my favorite genre. It really goes back to my love of Star Wars. I would encourage you to go and check out a Star Wars podcast that I do. Again, that's available at mynerdworld.net, and I lay out there in the first 2 episodes why I'm such a massive fan of Star Wars, like so many millions are. But I saw Star Wars in the theater with my dad back in 1977 when I was 5 years old. And like so many kids that age, I was hooked from the moment I saw that film. This genre and the genre of space opera was around long before Star Wars came about, but over the years and through the different facets of my life, I've just really come to appreciate what space opera does and what space opera has to offer. And it is a very sort of wide genre, even though it's considered very niche. I had initially thought about and did a few self-publishing podcasts. I am an author. I've written a trilogy with 2 more books on the way. One's complete. The other one's about halfway finished. I'm actually on vacation this week, and I'm planning on wrapping up the 5th book soon in my EMBARK series. And I plan on continuing to write more and even have plans and a plot laid out for a series of books that are more of epic fantasy but still fall into a bit of that space opera genre. But I just like everything that you can do within space opera. The human element that and the emotion that comes with this particular genre set out in space, and the criteria that a lot of people look for when it comes to this particular genre. So I did the self-publishing podcast, and I quickly realized that if that was going to be beneficial to anybody, I was going to have to put a lot more work into it. I'm a full-time radio talk show host here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I write my novels on the side, and I do my podcasts on the side. And I didn't want to put out a product in the self-publishing podcast world that was subpar. I thought perhaps I could fill a niche being a newer author. My first book, EMBARK, The Great Evacuation, Book 1, came out in late 2018. And again, I've put out 2 books since then. And I thought maybe I had something that I could offer newer authors. But again, not having the time because of all the other projects and the full-time job that I have to devote what would be needed to make that podcast beneficial, I decided to go ahead and shelve that idea. And that's when the idea for doing a space opera podcast came about. Because I consume already so much content within reading and watching movies when it comes to space opera that would be an easier and honestly a podcast that's a lot more fun for me to do. And that's why I decided to go the route of doing a space opera podcast. So I thought I'd kick off the first official episode and just talk a bit about what space opera is. And rather than use just my words, right, I'm going to appeal to an article here at tor.com. And I'll add my own commentary throughout this particular piece. But the writer of this article does a really good job, Emmett Asher Perrin, of really breaking down what a space opera is. And so I wanted to share this with you as an intro to space opera on a space opera podcast. The term dropped into the lexicon by a fan. He was a fan writer, Wilson Tucker, initially appeared in the fanzine Les Zombies back in 1941. It was meant to invoke the recently coined term soap opera, which then applied to radio dramas. It was a derogatory way of referring to a bombastic adventure tale with spaceships and ray guns. Now, since then, the definition of space opera has been renewed and expanded and gone through eras of disdain and revival. And the umbrella term covers a large portion of science fiction available to the public. Its critical opposite is usually cited as hard science fiction, denoting a story in which science and mathematics are carefully considered in the creation of the premise, leading to a tale that might contain more plausible elements, right? This had led some critics to posit that space opera is simply fantasy in space. But it isn't really. And attempting to make that distinction is a pretty fascinating exercise when all is said and done. From what I've read of other people's definition of space opera, these are really operatic tales of people and emotion taking place in space. I think the caveat normally, and they get into it in the article, is it needs to be set out in space, maybe involving multiple planets, most of the time aliens, but that's not necessary. Now, of course, if you're the sort of person who terms anything with a fantastic element as fantasy, then sure, space opera does fall into that sector. But then again, so does horror and magical realism and most children's books and any other number of subgenres. The answer as to how much any given qualifier for a subgenre truly matters, it's always up for debate. Paring it all down to your favorite stories, nothing but a set of rules is a tasking journey that no mortal deserves to go and suffer through. So, something about the genre space opera is distinct. So what is it? Now, highlighting the variations can make a heaping difference in helping people explain what they enjoy in fiction. And to that end, the definition of space opera has had quite a journey in the popular lexicon. So to start, A word from the space opera Renaissance. This was written by David Hartwell and Catherine Kramer. Their book defines the genre as a colorful, dramatic, large-scale science fiction adventure. Competently and sometimes beautifully written, usually focused on a sympathetic, heroic central character and plot action, and usually set in the relatively distant future, and in space or on other worlds. Characteristically optimistic in tone, it often deals with war, piracy, military virtues, and very large-scale action with large stakes. Now, plenty of those ideas apply to a wide spread of fantasy tales, particularly epic fantasy. A central hero, war, military virtues, colorful and dramatic yarns, large-scale action and stakes. The trappings are still different in space opera, with stories set in the far future and the use of space travel and so forth. But what about that optimism? It's an interesting standout, as is the tendency toward an adventure narrative. Now, epic fantasy can end happily and be adventurous at times, but it often doesn't read with the plethora of either of those traits. Lord of the Rings is harrowing, right? Song of Ice and Fire is full of trauma and darkness. The Wheel of Time turns on, minute detail and precise depictions of what that world has been thought through in every aspect. Fantasy tends to examine extreme specificity and worlds in turmoil. Space opera doesn't have to in order to work. So outside the fact that this copy and what they wrote is throwing some shade on some of these other genres, right? We can glean a better sense of what space opera meant to many, say, 7 decades ago, and how it was viewed. And what it reveals is perhaps a larger problem. Why has space opera always been compared to other genres throughout its history? Why can't it just be its own thing? Now, the macrocosm answer is simple, though. Stories are stories. They all rely on similar devices, tropes, and narrative styles. There is very little that sets one genre apart from another in the broadest sense, and that's perfectly fine. Now, the microcosm answer is more complex. Space opera used to be an insult, and it has taken years and the advent of incredibly successful space operas like Star Wars to allow it to go and stand on its own. But perhaps all those years of hanging out in the shadows has made some fans more hesitant in parsing out what they love about the genre. So, what exactly is it? No, I know for me, a lot of it comes back to Star Wars as to why I love space opera. Just because I love Star Wars so much that anything that has that type of connectivity to the thing that I was a fan of before I was a fan of anything in my entire life, I am inevitably and most likely going to be a fan of. But it's more than that. For me personally, I love vehicles. I also love stories that are relatable. And there's something about the space opera genre that allows the opportunity for the content consumer to be transported to a fantastical place that doesn't exist, but still feels somewhat familiar. This was a balance that I tried to make when I began writing, and I continue to write my EMBARK science fiction space opera series. I don't have any aliens in my stories. I also wouldn't call them at all hard science fiction. I use a bit of science fantasy. I set it far enough in the future, even though I never give an exact time, but I set it far enough in the future to allow for things like faster than light travel, to allow for things like anti-gravity lift manifolds that we can place on the bottom of vehicles that we've created to be able to traverse through atmosphere on planets and then through space again without having to go through the issue of having to consume a ton of power to get a ship off the planet, things like that. But I wanted to make my stories relatable to the average reader by setting it in the future without doing what George Lucas did and going a galaxy far, far away. this is something that I thought the Wachowskis did really, really well with Jupiter Ascending, is they added in a fantasy element to our existing universe, and they did it in a really clever way, and we'll talk a bit more about that in the next part of the podcast here when we do our look back epic this week, which will be Jupiter Ascending. Getting back to the article, the writer goes on to say, as a fan of the genre, I find the Western comparison hilarious because Westerns are very much not my thing. And I kind of agree with the reader here. I'm not a huge fan of Westerns either. However, George Lucas was inspired by Westerns, and so was The Mandalorian. And I think there's actually an interesting argument to be made, and we'll talk about this in upcoming episodes when it comes to The Mandalorian. It is a space opera, don't misunderstand, but is it not closer to being a Western than a space opera? Which continues to add layers to the question of what exactly, constitutes being a space opera. Okay, so what makes the difference? So we're getting back into the article. Why are aliens and robots important? Why are ray guns and space travel better than horses and six-shooters? There's a part of me, the writer says, that wants to argue for introspection in that vein. Robots and aliens are often used as a way to examine aspects of human nature, to dissect ourselves by using other beings as a template. Dwarves and orcs can do this too, but seem a bit more earthbound, whereas robots and aliens are part of our future. They ask questions about where we might go and what challenges we might face as we evolve. And again, I'm going to be referencing my books a lot when it comes to talking about the genre specifically, even though, this is not necessarily a blatant promotion for my book, even though it'd be great if you purchase the book to support the podcast, be that as it may. Just because I write in this particular genre, I can speak to what they're talking about here. I have an upcoming story that's a spinoff from the third book in my series that is about one particular character and their AI robot companion, and through no intent, that story ended up very much being the avatar or analogy to a boy and his dog. I had a beloved dog for 11 years, Bella, who unfortunately became very ill, and we had to put to sleep last week. That was an incredibly devastating thing for myself and my family to do. I was incredibly close to Bella, and I love my Bella, and I miss my Bella deeply. When I wrote this spin-off story this year, I knew that Bella was dealing with some issues, but we had never been closer than we were over the course of these last 8 months. And I didn't even realize that the story that I was writing and these conversations that this main character, the protagonist, is having with his AI companion were really analogous to the relationship that I had with my beloved Bella. She couldn't talk to me, but I subconsciously was crafting that dialogue and that conversation as if I was having a conversation with the dog that I love. Getting back to the article, but there's also the opera part of space opera, something that doesn't get enough credit in the phrase. Right? Opera is all about performance, and it's about emotion. You don't need a transition of an opera to understand it because the spectacle of it should transcend the need. Opera works with visuals, music, dance, poetry, as many forms of art as we can to shove into the collective space and time. Opera is bigger than all of us. George Lucas has often said that he considered, especially the original trilogy and A New Hope, you could actually run that as a silent movie, and there's a level in which that movie actually works as a silent film. Space operas often deliver in those terms. They are writ large and bursting with color and light. Is space opera just fantasy in space? Do each their own that definition? To each their own that definition. But there's a difference between the two all the same. And even if we don't need to pin it down, we can at least honor the fact that space opera is no longer an insult. It encompasses many of the stories that we treasure. Now, I jotted down, and we're going to be talking about a lot of these particular films, and this is certainly not a complete list by any stretch of the imagination. But I decided to jot down a series of films just at the top of my head that I personally believe fit into that space opera genre. And what I find really fascinating about it, once I was done writing the list, was how diverse those movies actually are. Okay, so Starship Troopers, Flash Gordon, Dune, Barbarella, The Last Starfighter, Serenity, Guardians of the Galaxy 1 and 2. I think there's an argument to be made that the Marvel Cinematic Universe Captain Marvel could be considered a space opera. Valerian, City of a Thousand Planets, Fifth Element, and of course, Star Wars, Star Trek, Battlestar Galactica. That's an incredibly diverse mix of movies, all that fall into essentially the science fiction category, but I also believe all of which can be viewed specifically as space operas. And again, it's that emotional part of the space opera genre that I really love. And it's something that I think Star Wars, George Lucas, and yes, all the films, including the sequel trilogy and the prequel trilogy, trapped into really well. That mythology. There's a fantasy element to the Star Wars movies. That is clear. They are science fantasy. But make no mistake, they are absolutely space operas. My EMBARK books are set in the future. Supposed to be rooted in humanity, right? No fantasy elements in terms of magic or mythology beyond your normal religion, but they are definitely space operas. Now, as always, as I do with all my podcasts, I'd like to know what you think. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com is the email address for all the podcasts. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. It's also the email that you can use to join the mailing list when it comes to My Nerd World and the EMBARK series, and that's going to be important a little bit later on in the show when I get into the big giveaway that I'm doing over the course of this week. By the way, if you join the mailing list, I will never sell your information, and I will never send you spam. That is a promise you can always expect from My Nerd World, the My Nerd World podcast, and certainly a space opera podcast.
You've been searching for one thing your whole life.
I want her found.
Make sure this is the right one.
It's her.
Good. Kill her.
Who are you?
I'm here to help you. Here we go.
I just need to know what in the hell is going on.
It can be difficult for people from underdeveloped worlds to hear that their planet is not the only inhabited planet.
Your Earth is a very small part of a very large industry.
I think we might have stumbled into a war with one of the most powerful dynasties in the universe.
Why is this happening to me?
You are royalty. We need a plan. We need firepower.
This week's look back here on a space opera podcast with My Nerd World is the Wachowskis' high concept, right? Big time. Jupiter Ascending. Now, this is a movie that I wanted to see in theaters, didn't end up seeing it in theaters, and really regretted that I didn't. Now, I'm going to be upfront. I'm kind of a fan of the Wachowskis. And that is, I really do enjoy their movies, and certainly what the Wachowskis have tried to do in breaking the mold, typical of what we see with big Hollywood blockbusters. There is no denying The Matrix was a game-changing film when it was released. I'm a big fan of the sequels as well. I thought that Revolutions and Reloaded and the trilogy in and of itself are fantastic, especially Revolutions. The ending battle in Revolutions, I just think is incredible. I really, really enjoy those movies. And something else that we'll be discussing on future episodes is whether or not the Matrix trilogy falls into the category of space opera. Now, it's missing one big fundamental thing, and that is the fact that it's not set in space. But I'm kind of the opinion that it does take place on Earth in the future, and I think there's an argument to be made that there are enough elements that you find normally in the definition of space opera where you could put the Matrix trilogy in that category, but that is for a different episode. Of course, the Wachowskis also did Speed Racer, which is another completely underrated film. Cloud Atlas, which I need to go and revisit again. I've only seen it once, and I remember I walked away from it not being all that impressed, but there is something about the Wachowskis films that do that, and it really takes repeated viewings to begin to appreciate what it is that they were going for and what it is that they accomplished. Now, I'm going to be referring to another article and adding in my 2 cents as we get into the look back in Jupiter Ascending this week. This one comes from Inverse, and the headline really says it all. The most underappreciated sci-fi movie on Netflix deserves another chance. This is written by D.S. Johnston. Of all the movies the Wachowski sisters have made, none is so unfairly reviled as Jupiter Ascending. Not even Speed Racer, the article says. Boasting a frankly impressive 27% critics rating on Rotten Tomatoes. It was called everything from unimaginative to a dumb action flick. How anybody, even if you hated Jupiter Ascending, how anybody can go and say that that film was unimaginative is beyond me. This 2015 feature was meant to be a breath of new life into a tired genre, but instead seemed to be the final nail in its coffin. However, the watching experience is more than just the critics' reviews. For such a fantastical movie, it starts off it starts off extremely terrestrial. Let me stop here. I had the opportunity to do a couple of interviews today about my science fiction space opera series, and one of them was on the Lowdown Show on YouTube. And Edwin, who hosts the show, said that he had started watching Jupiter Ascending, but didn't get that far into it. And I think that's where people get tripped up with this movie. The opening third of the film is not very representative of the rest of the movie. It starts off a little wonky, grounded in a lot of reality before we begin to get into the fantastical stuff, and the story really goes and takes off. You need to give this movie a chance. Yes, it's got some weird concepts in it. Yes, Channing Tatum, and the article will get into this, has wolf pointy ears and flies around on like skates that he can, laser skates. Okay, but it's actually kind of rad. It's kind of cool. And there are some sequences in this film, especially the finale, that are incredible. They really are. The concepts on the spaceships, the art design of the film, the way that it's shot, it is an incredibly, just on a visual level, impressive film, but it also has some real depth in terms of storytelling as well. This 2015 feature, it starts off extremely terrestrial. Mila Kunis's character, Jupiter Jones, describes her life as the child of a Russian mathematician and the astronomer son of an English diplomat who was killed off before she is even born. You smash cut to the present day, and Jupiter is living in Chicago and has a job cleaning houses of the rich and famous. Meanwhile, in space, 3 siblings of the Abraxas family are fighting over the most precious part of their mother's inheritance, a planet called Earth. They debate who has claim over it, and this leads the youngest brother, Titus, to send Kane Wise to fetch Jupiter. Kane, played with a surprisingly fitting lack of emotion by Channing Tatum, rescues her from a medical procedure turned abduction, but loses her to fellow captors. I actually think that there's a fix the Wachowskis could have done, but unfortunately George Lucas beat him to the punch. But I think there was another way they could have pulled it off. If the Wachowskis had gone the route in Jupiter Ascending of setting up some type of opening crawl, it doesn't have to be like Star Wars. Blade Runner had an opening crawl. I think if they had dispensed with some of the more rudimentary beginnings in the story, people would have been able to grasp faster what it is that they were trying to accomplish. The beginning of the film has quite a bit of exposition, and it's necessary with a film like this of this scope that's trying to tell an incredibly large, wide, tale in a relatively short period of time of 2 hours. Now, all these events that I just described happen one after another. Now, this makes the Mila Kunis character a human MacGuffin in the fight between uber-rich siblings and the rogue Kane, played out in stunning visuals as only the Wachowskis can pull off. The plot, honestly, is merely a vehicle for the visual language of the world it inhabits. From Kane's little wolfen ears to the spaceships on Earth leaving crop circles, every detail is thought out, even if that thought is just, man, wouldn't this look cool? The costumes alone warrant a watch. Every battle costume is badass, and every ball gown is extravagant. The script, underneath about 7 layers of world building and action scenes, is a genuine statement about capitalism and the use of human life as a consumable resource, and a bit about bureaucracy. Here's the thing, though, okay? It's not overt about it, and that's what I thought they did really well, which is kind of surprising. Because both the Wachowski sisters, used to be brothers, now sisters, the Wachowski sisters are very politically inclined in their personal life. Thankfully, they are able to accomplish what George Lucas was able to accomplish, and that is inject politics, right? And most good storytelling can do this if this is what they're trying to accomplish, right? They're able to sort of inject politics into their stories without beating people over the head or turning people off. Something, again, very similar happened when I was crafting my EMBARK trilogy. It was only when it was finished that I realized that there is a subtext that runs through all 3 books that is very relatable to our modern day, especially when it comes to social networking and to a lesser extent politics, even though politics is not something that I get into in any great detail, and certainly not enough where you be even to tell what my political leanings were just by reading the books. The Wachowskis, in my opinion, did a really good job of not being on the nose with their political statements and opinions while still providing them to make it palatable for a large audience. There is a lot of clunky dialogue, but it's the kind of dialogue you can chuckle at, not wince over. Like when Kane explains to he's spliced with wolf DNA to Jupiter, and she flirtatiously answers, "I love dogs, I've always loved dogs." One of the easiest traps for space operas to fall into is taking itself too seriously. Contemporary examples, like Guardians of the Galaxy and Thor Ragnarok, lean heavily on humor and pointing out their own inherent ridiculousness. Now, Jupiter Ascending takes those things completely in the other direction. And instead, we are given Academy Award-winning actor Eddie Redmayne giving 110% on a so-so villain speech as Balaam Abraxas, rasping and enunciating each and every word. And I don't particularly like that character, but guess what? You're not supposed to like that character. It's kind of the point. Now, if this is the sort of sci-fi isn't up your alley, it would still serve a useful watch as a barometer to measure against other sci-fi films. It is not a Marvel movie, and it certainly is not a Star Wars episode. In many ways, it's the complete opposite of those things. But by learning to appreciate all there is to like in Jupiter Ascending, it's much easier to see how other movies could be improved and what they do well. It is kind of one of the trappings when it comes to space operas, that it seems as if very few of them, and this is not singular to space operas, but we're talking about space operas, right? It seems like very few of them get released and are given a chance, or they get everything right. Space operas are a difficult beast because they're always kind of be compared to Star Wars, and whenever you go to introduce a new IP, if it's not something people are familiar with, they're going to be less inclined to go see it. You know, Fifth Element was a success at the box office, but really found its fandom in home video release and then DVD and Blu-ray, right? Valerian, I enjoy Valerian quite a bit. I thought the 2 lead characters, while in and of themselves are a good actor and actress, I like both of those characters. They had zero chemistry together for a couple that we're supposed to see essentially falling in love throughout the movie. And yet that film is incredibly ambitious, visually stunning, and really a lot of fun. But it was a new IP, and people didn't gravitate towards it. Jupiter Ascending tried to burst into the theaters using the credibility of the Matrix films, but unfortunately, I think with a lot of people, they didn't like Revolutions and Reloaded, so they were kind of turned off from what the Wachowskis were trying to do, and therefore it just wasn't given a chance in the box office. Nobody went to see it, but it's fascinating to see now that there's a lot of people that are gravitating towards this film on giving it a second look. And I know that every time that I go back to watch this movie, I personally enjoy it more and more. So I would definitely go and check out Jupiter Ascending if you have not done that before. Let me put it this way. You're not going to, even if you don't like it, you're not going to walk away disappointed.
Gather round, children. The Earth was destroyed by a great war. I was programmed to protect you. And now, we start again. Does anyone know the story of the three little pigs? The first little pig built a house out of straw. The second little pig built a house out of sticks. For the third little pig, he built a house out of stone. One day, a big bad wolf came along and said, little pig, let me in, or I'll huff, and I'll puff, and I'll blow your house in.
Wolf she was talking about?
Mother?
That's her.
Raised by Wolves, 2020, Ridley Scott. The trailer dropped a couple of weeks back. I am so excited for this HBO Max streaming show. All right, truth be told, I love Prometheus. I love Alien Covenant. I'm a fan of the Alien series. And I won't go into which of the Alien films I like and I don't like. If you have not seen the director's cut of David Fincher's Alien 3, you are doing yourself a disservice. And again, we're walking into that weird territory where does this qualify as a space opera? I personally think it does. We'll get into some of the details here in just a moment. I also think the Prometheus and Alien Covenant, while they are science fiction films, definitely, while they are horror movies for the most part, I also think that just based off the fact that we're talking about a future set in space, multiple worlds, we're in the world of space opera. Definitely Prometheus. And I love what those films do in terms of mythology. And again, the ambition that Ridley Scott had in trying to open up that alien world. See, I'm kind of that type of movie goer where I'm easy to please. I like to be entertained, and that's my criteria is pretty low. If I walk away entertained, I'm willing to look past faults. Okay, I love The Last Jedi, and I absolutely adore The Rise of Skywalker. It's one of my favorite all-time space operas of the moment right now. My opinions shift depending on day and mood, but at the moment, The Rise of Skywalker is probably my favorite space opera. I'm also not a person that gets bogged down in newer films expanding upon older classics, and the people that make the argument that the original films have now been ruined because of the newer films and the changing of the canon. That kind of stuff doesn't bother me. I can still always go back and watch, say, the original trilogy for the people that don't like the sequel trilogy and say that that they want to forget about it. It doesn't matter to me. For those that really love Alien and Aliens and they don't like Prometheus or Alien Covenant because of what it does in terms of explaining where the aliens come from, that kind of stuff doesn't get to me. Letting you know a little bit about me. Raised by Wolves, however, looks spectacular, and I think it does fall into the space opera category. Androids struggle to raise human children on a mysterious planet in the first trailer for Raised by Wolves. This article comes from Jennifer Oliette. It's a new science fiction series coming to HBO Max, courtesy of Ridley Scott. The 10-episode series was initially a straight-to-series order for TNT, but moved to HBO last October. Scott even directed the first 2 episodes, making this his U.S. TV directorial debut. I'm always searching for new frontiers in the sci-fi genre, and have found a true original in Raised by Wolves, a wholly distinct and imaginative world full of characters struggling with existential questions, Scott told Deadline in Hollywood back in 2018. About what drew him to the project, what makes us human, what constitutes a family, and what if we could start over again and erase the mess we've made of our planet? Would we survive? Would we do better? Now, the tagline for the series gives little away. Mother was programmed to protect everyone after Earth had been destroyed. When the big bad wolf shows up, she is the one we must trust. But the basic premise revealed during the development is that the story involves two androids serving as mother, Amanda Collin, and father, Abubakar Salim, figures on a strange virgin planet. They are programmed to raise human children to rebuild the population. However, the people of the fledgling colony develop stark religious differences, and the androids learn that controlling the beliefs of humans is a treacherous and difficult task. Now, judging by the trailer, the actual series is much weirder and more complicated than that brief description. Gather around children, you heard in the trailer, that's what the mother says. It appears to be story time for her young, but this one might give them nightmares. The Earth was destroyed by a great war, she says. I was programmed to protect you. And now we start again. Then Mother launches into a creepy retelling of the Three Little Pigs as images flash by in rapid succession, becoming increasingly strange and violent. Travis Fimmel plays Marcus, who seems to be the bad guy in the series. He was also the protagonist in Warcraft, which is a film that, oddly, I like more on repeated viewings. Or is he? All those leaked images of a blood-splattered mother emanating banshee walls with enough acoustic energy to make heads explode suggest otherwise. And what's Mother doing crouched and howling by a giant pit? The big bad wolf she was talking about, that's her, we are told. Now, Raised by Wolves debuts on HBO Max September 3rd, 2020. Will it be good? It's hard to say, although the production values seem pretty impressive, and there are some strong alien vibes. It's Ridley Scott, so we'll definitely be watching. I want to toss something out there, too. I have a bit of a theory. I can't help but wonder if this might actually fit into the alien universe. Just a theory! We're talking androids. We're talking the future. In the alien films, Earth wasn't destroyed yet. However, and I doubt they would reference it, if you get into Alien Resurrection, there is a moment where they call Earth an S-hole. Who wants to go back there? Depending on how far in the future, this could be a circumstance where we could be seeing some cross-universe action going on. Just want to throw that out there because Ridley Scott has talked about doing that before, and there are some individuals out there that theorize that the alien universe actually kind of coexists with the Blade Runner universe. By the way, side note, I had a theory that the Terminator franchise actually could be connected with the Matrix universe. If you were to take Skynet to its fruition and Judgment Day happening, the ramifications of Judgment Day could actually kick off the events of what ends up taking in the original Matrix. Go ahead. Allow your mind to be blown. That's okay. You can let it happen. Just a theory. I haven't really fleshed it out or looked at dates or times or anything. I just thought it was interesting. So what do you think? You looking forward to Raised by Wolves? Am I out of my mind for calling this a space opera? Am I just happy about it because it's science fiction and I wanted to include it in this podcast? TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. All right, before we wrap up the show, I want to give you the top 10 Amazon best-selling space operas at the moment. As a self-published author, I am not in this top 10, at least not yet. I'd like to be one day. If you buy some books, maybe that'll help. Talk a little bit about that in a moment. But right now, your top 10 on Amazon and space operas goes like this. Rick Partlow, Kinetic Strike, Drop Trooper Book number 2 at number 10. The Service of Mars, Starship's Mage, Book 9 by Glenn Stewart is at number 9. The Collapsing Empire, The Interdependency Book 1 by John Scalise is at number 8. Rick Partlow, again, Contact Front, Drop Trooper Book number 1, number 7. Frank Herbert's Dune, number 6. Cannot wait for that trailer next week. I am a huge fan of Denis Villeneuve. Blade Runner 2049 is amazing, as is Arrival, and I cannot wait to see what he's going to do with Dune. Space opera, no denying it. Tasmin Muir, Harrow the Ninth, the Locked Tomb Trilogy, Book 2 is at number 5. Final Days, Escape, Jasper T. Scott is at number 4. Nathan Highstand, The Resistance, the complete series, books 1 through 3 is at number 3. Jasper T. Scott, again, Final Days, Colony is at number 2. And at number 1 this week on the best-selling Amazon space operas, Star Force, Maddie, Star Force Universe book number 77 is at number 1 by Aerki Gir. That is your top 10 space operas for the week at Amazon.com. I hope you enjoyed the list, and I would definitely go and check out any of those books. And that wraps up the show this week. I hope you enjoyed it. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. Before I let you go, it is giveaway week here on My Nerd World. All week, My Nerd World will be accepting entries to win autographed copies of the EMBARK trilogy. That's EMBARK, The Great Evacuation Book 1. That is EMBARK, Treasure in Darkness Book 2. And that is EMBARK, The Vanishing War Book 3. They are available in ebook right now, by the way. Book 1 is 99 cents at mynerdworld.net, and books 2 and 3 are just $2.99. Now, your first prize, which we will draw on next week's Space Opera podcast and on the Star Wars podcast. I'll basically do one drawing, and I'll play it on both shows. Your first prize will be a signed, complete EMBARK trilogy with the updated Book 1 cover. Includes free shipping. Second, third, and fourth prizes will be signed copies of EMBARK Book 1, the first edition of the paperback, also with free shipping. Again, names will be drawn randomly next Saturday. Listening not required to win. The deadline to enter is midnight, August 29th. So that would be Friday night going into Saturday. Estimated retail value of prize 1 is $42, and first, second, and third estimated retail value is $13.99. So, John, how do you enter? I'm glad you asked. Go to mynerdworld.net and go to the My Nerd blog. Actually, there is a link right there on the homepage at mynerdworld.net. Just click on that link and it'll take you to where you can sign up for the mailing list. That's all you got to do. Put your name down on the contact form, say, I want to enter the EMBARK series, or just write EMBARK or contest. I'll include you on the mailing list and you'll be entered in the drawing. Again, no purchase required to win. And I hope you'll take the time to go to mynerdworld.net and check it out. I'll be back again next week for another episode. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. You can also use that address if you don't want to go to the website and you want to go and enter right now. If you email me, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com, and just say EMBARK contest, I will get you on the mailing list and you can enter that way as well. Thanks for checking the show out. I look forward to hearing from you, and we'll talk to you again next week.
My Nerd World.